I'm not being
Hang on. Let me just bring Rafe. Hang on, Femi. Let me bring Rafe Heydel-Mankoo on. Rafe, I know where Femi's coming from when he's saying that the balance has been that we have to somehow taper the success of Shakespeare because of the harms of colonialism. But we're also losing sight of the fact that he was a brilliant writer, and there's something to be celebrated there.
Yes, absolutely. Look, Shakespeare is a global phenomenon because he speaks to his plays are universal, and they have timeless insights into the human character, and they deal with issues that are just as relevant today and enduring themes of, love, war, family squabbles, and everything else. And we know that because, you see, Shakespeare is a global phenomenon, even in places like China and Japan, which have fiercely proud, patriotic populations and a great history of literature in their own right. India as well, the Mahabharata, the Ramayana, and so forth. But even they understand the universality of Shakespeare as the world's greatest writer. In fact, the Chinese asked this very same Shakespeare Birthplace Trust for permission to rebuild Shakespeare's home in China using Elizabethan techniques. They have national festivals about Shakespeare in Japan as well. And you had Kurosawa, the greatest director in Japan, doing Macbeth also. That's the universality over here. And the criticism that's being put out by this research, by the trust and so forth, is that presenting Shakespeare as the world's greatest genius presents European culture as the world standard for high art. And I'm sorry, but Western culture is the standard for much high art. That's why so many Asians play European classical music, for example. Now, that wasn't the case when Shakespeare was alive. In the 16th century, Asia was the global powerhouse and cultural powerhouse, and Elizabethan England was a cultural backwater. But for the last 300 years, Europe and the West has stood head and shoulders above every other civilization. Femi mentions African authors. There are 2,000 languages in Africa, but as Femi's pointed out, most of those were oral. 80% of African languages don't have a written tradition, so they weren't capable of producing a Shakespeare. The most profound and sophisticated music, art, and culture has come from the West, and we need to lose the embarrassment and be proud to admit the genius of the West. Celebrate that Shakespeare was an Englishman, and that's what sticks in the craw of the anti-Western ideologues that run our cultural institutions, because they cannot stand that an Englishman is the greatest writer that the world has ever produced, and they will do anything to diminish and downplay that achievement.
Okay, all right.
May I just come back quickly?
I've just thought of J.M.
10 seconds.
Did I not read J.M. Coetzee? He's an African author, isn't he, Femi?
Pardon?
J.M. Coetzee?
Okay, great. Well, I'm not familiar with their work, but
he won the Nobel Prize.
Possibly. Great. Now,
Brief,
if we
Femi, we're so close to the time, but can I just say, is there not space for both?
On the screen, we have, was Shakespeare a white supremacist? The Trust, from what I read in the Telegraph article that I was sent, no one has said Shakespeare was a white supremacist. So that is just kind of scaremongering. No one has said that. The Trust has said that celebrating and saying what Rafe has said here, that he's the greatest writer of all time, is linked to that, is linked to the idea of European supremacy. Rafe mentioned classical music, Western classical music. There's notes in Indian classical music that don't even exist in Western classical music. There's microtones that don't exist in Western classical music, in Indian and Arabic classical music. There's so much culture outside of the West, which the West doesn't want to necessarily recognize and appreciate, because if you do so, then you recognize that you're not superior to them. And Shakespeare, being a great writer, not being a white supremacist, I've played Shakespeare professionally on stage. And no one has said which Shakespeare was a white supremacist. It's scaremongering to put on the screen, was Shakespeare a white supremacist, because no one has said this. However, you can also accept the possibility that there might also be other great artists, other great musicians, other great writers on Shakespeare's level.
And I think there is room.
In other places.
There is room for both. But thank you, gentlemen.